It was a quiet night at Britain's busiest mainland oil port of Milford Haven, the home of 3 refineries which dominate the skyline and handle a quarter of all Britain's petrol. At the port control centre, they were monitoring the slow approach of the supertanker Sea Empress. For this final approach, a harbour pilot with local knowledge of the treacherous approach channel had taken over navigational control. At 8 minutes past 8, something went badly wrong.
We're getting reports that a 147,000-ton tanker has run aground in South Wales, and it's said to be spilling oil.
By dawn, it's clear that the huge Norwegian-owned supertanker has run aground while en route to the Texaco oil refinery in Milford Haven. She's still stuck, and by now a full port emergency has been declared and shipping banned from a 10-mile radius. The nightmare that Britain always dreaded has actually happened. It was to take nearly a week to get her off, a week of terrible oil pollution at sea and inshore after she bounced on and off the rocks, and a week of growing recriminations about the way in which the whole salvage and clean-up operation was handled. Tonight, Panorama looks for answers to some of the questions still surrounding the Sea Empress disaster. Why, after she ran aground, did it take nearly a week to bring her under control? Why was the tug power so crucial in stabilizing the vessel such a long time in coming? And now, with a fishing ban imposed over most of the Pembrokeshire coast, is there some evidence that the worst pollution could have been avoided? She was 904 feet long, a single-hulled tanker, a modern vessel built in Spain, registered in Liberia, and run by a large ship-managing company in Glasgow. The master was an experienced Russian tanker captain who spoke good English. The Sea Empress was moving up the Western Channel into Milford Haven when she ran aground. The reasons remain unclear. She was refloated with the help of the rising tide and 4 small harbour tugs, but she was soon trapped again in a huge deep water basin surrounded by jagged rocks.
She was trapped in a kind of saucer. The seabed in the Milford Haven Bay is with pinnacles. And it appeared that the vessel had run aground, sank deeper in the water, and was then trapped in this saucer where we could not find a way out. So that made us realize we need buoyancy in the ship.
How on earth did she get into that position in the first place?
That was easy, because then she could go over it. She was having a draft of less than 16 meters. But when she hit, then she sank in the water. And then she was only trapped.
But we now know there was a chance to free the trapped tanker as early as Thursday night. That's the view of the man who speaks for Milford Haven pilots.
She came in here and they're trying to hold her in this.
He says a golden opportunity was lost when the pilot on board asked the control room for permission to move the vessel out.
He was waiting and waiting and waiting. And eventually he realized that the time was getting too short. And so he went down and back again to the harbour master, and permission was refused.
Now,
and he obviously felt totally dismayed with that decision.
does that decision, you are a master mariner, been a pilot here for 30 years, does that decision make any sense to you?
None whatsoever.
Because if she'd been taken out to sea, what would have been the result?
It would have given them a breathing space, and the ship would not have been in any particular danger. She would not have sunk, and
there would have been no further breach of the tanks.
That's right.
And there were other worrying signs that night that not everything was as it should be. A vital radar covering where the vessel grounded was broken. An inquiry will establish how important this was.
The whole radar throughout the port, which was state-of-the-art in 1984, should have been replaced and was recommended to be replaced by the then harbour master in 1994. It had a 10-year life. It has been breaking down ever since, and certainly since September 1995, the area where this accident and then disaster happened was not covered by the radar.
Yeah, we're all ready to connect our messenger on the line.
On the morning of the second day, the tugs battled to control and stabilize the stricken tanker. There'd been a small breach in her tanks and oil, some 1,500 tons, had leaked out. The salvage contract went to the Dutch firm SMIT TAK, but there was soon controversy about their strategy. Transport Secretary Sir George Young arrived to see for himself. He sought to reassure.
Everything that possibly could be done is being done, and I think the best thing that I can do as Secretary of State is to make sure that all the agencies continue to cooperate well with each other and get on to deal with this very serious incident.
But there were doubts about the ability of the salvors to control and then stabilize the tanker inside the basin before increasing her buoyancy to help her escape. The Sea Empress was first moved into deep water inside the basin and anchored there with tugs trying to hold her in place.
I was told by the representatives of the salvors and the MPCU that the idea was, because of her 23-metre draft, they couldn't take her out of the position she was in, and they couldn't bring her into port either. She was literally stuck in this deep pool. The only way they were going to get her out of there was hold her in position, bring a smaller tanker, take off approximately 20,000 tons of crude oil. That would lift her up in the water, and they could do what they wanted with her then.
Well, what was wrong with that strategy?
The resources that they had available just couldn't hold the vessel in place in order for the lightning to take place.
The key problem was the amount of tug power that could be brought in to first control, then hold the stricken tanker in one spot. But now there's disagreement between the salvors and the managers of the Sea Empress over how much extra tug power was needed. Was the problem one of tug power?
I think it was. I think that tugs were the issue here. I think that the lack of tugs and the lack of power was the reason why they didn't get control of the ship. It was imperative to get control of the ship.
You are adamant in maintaining that you had enough tug power from the first moment of the salvage operation?
We had sufficient tug power at any moment of the operation. Hindsight is very easy. You could say now, maybe because of the current, maybe because of the bad weather, but you cannot fight elements. If you have a vessel in that weather conditions, in sort of afloat in a saucer, there's no tug in the world you can pull her out. Yeah, who decides then whether you have sufficient power or not?
Mr. Coffman, I'm not a salvage expert, but it seems to me if you had had double the tug power, you would have had double the control.
I do not agree.
Mr. Kofferman of SMIT TAK is adamant that tug power had nothing to do with the problem whatsoever. He said it was simply a question of buoyancy. Do you agree or disagree?
I don't agree. I think buoyancy is, and obviously buoyancy is a significant part of the ship's not buoyant, then she doesn't go anywhere. But I think it's simplistic. We estimate that with the tidal flow of maybe 3 to 4 knots, 800 tons of pressure on the side of the ship. Therefore, I guess you need significant tug power to control that vessel.
And was that tug power there in the beginning?
Not in the beginning, no.
But there should have been. Following an accident in January 1993, the tanker Brer went down off the west coast off Shetland, spilling her entire oil cargo. The lessons of this tragedy were highlighted in a universally acclaimed investigation by Lord Donaldson, whose recommendations were supposed to ensure no repetition of such a disaster. Lord Donaldson said a powerful tug should be stationed at each of 3 key points around the coast to tow damaged tankers out of danger. But there were just 2 tugs on station, one at Dover, one in Scotland. Crucially, there was no tug on standby for the western approaches in Milford Haven. The problem was that the government had a contract with 3 salvors to cover the western approaches, but the contract only provided coverage subject to availability. The government allowed the salvors to insert a no guarantee condition into the contract. As it happened, the tug allotted to the western approaches was working off Portugal, so when tragedy struck there was no coverage, and whoever was in charge apparently saw no reason to call one in. Panorama has learned that shortly after the Sea Empress ran aground, at least 2 offers of help were made from powerful tugs, tugs whose combined power may very well have stabilized and controlled the Sea Empress, but the offers were politely declined. We've learned that the massive Chinese tug Daewoo, stationed in Falmouth, offered assistance within hours of the grounding of the Sea Empress on Thursday night, but that offer was not taken up by the salvors, even though they themselves had nothing in her class.
On Thursday night, we heard about the grounding of the Sea Empress. We immediately offered our services to the salvage companies at that moment in England. We offered the assistance of this 20,000 horsepower tug called Daewoo. All the salvage companies were long aware that she was sitting here in Falmouth, and it was just a reminder to tell them that the tug was here for immediate assistance. Apparently, our services were rejected on Thursday night. There was no need for the tug to steam to Milford Haven.
And there was also plenty of tug power available at short notice elsewhere. There were at least 6 strong tugs around the west coast, 2 at Swansea, 1 at Avonmouth, and 3 in the Liverpool Bay. Further away there was 1 at Plymouth, 2 at Yarmouth, and 2 off Southern Ireland. Yet in spite of all these available tugs, it was to take a full 48 hours before anything with sufficient power to try to control the Sea Empress was to turn up. Meanwhile, the salvage work was abandoned because of a storm warning. By now, the oil with its terrible black signature was on land. The clean-up began. Paper towels against crude oil, and the all-too-familiar pictures began to reappear. But on Saturday, by accident rather than design, a second opportunity suddenly presented itself. It was a moment when the whole impending disaster might easily have been averted.
On Saturday morning, she was still trapped in this basin. And in view of the bad weather forecast, the wind forecast, it was decided to turn the ship round to head out, so that she would be heading more or less head to the wind and sea. This was achieved by the pilots on board with the existing tugs, and in the process of doing this, the ship came within 300 or 400 feet of the entrance buoys. And the pilot knew that at that moment he could easily have dragged her out to sea and to safety.
He could have escaped.
The ship could have escaped. He contacted the harbour master and asked for permission to take the ship to sea. The harbour master came back to him and said, "Yes, I agree entirely with your decision, but I'm in a room full of people and they are all saying no and shaking their heads." And the net result was that the ship was not taken to sea, and so yet another golden opportunity was lost.
What do you make of that decision?
I fail to understand it. I fail to understand it completely.
Panorama has repeatedly asked the Milford Haven port authorities to answer the suggestion that they could have resolved the tanker emergency as early as 2 days after she grounded. In a brief statement from the Coast Guard, we were told that these decisions were taken because there were serious potential risks to personnel, the tugs, and the environment. By now, the Sea Empress was turned to face the coming storm, but then the lines to the tugs had to be freed and the tanker ran onto the rocks again. She began to bleed more oil, and as the storm strengthened, residents from nearby St Anne's Head were evacuated as fears grew of an explosion. At 9:15 p.m., a full 48 hours after she'd first offered her services, the Chinese tug Daewoo left Falmouth to help out. Disaster day. Her cargo belched from inspection valve covers. The storm had now grown so fierce that the rest of the crew abandoned ship.
Tell the crew that they must be ready for you in 5 minutes.
Over 48 hours had elapsed since the grounding and there was still no control of the vessel. There'd been insufficient tug power to stabilize her or move her out of her sea basin. But as the storm abated, another note of optimism was sounded.
We've had some pretty horrendous weather out there, winds in excess of 60 miles an hour. Our thrust today is to regain better control of the vessel and to put people on board as soon as practicable.
As the Sea Empress enjoyed a rare calm, the most powerful tug, the much-delayed Chinese vessel Daewoo, finally arrived. Her first problem was not one of salvage, but of linguistics. The Chinese, British and Dutch salvors didn't always speak a common language, according to tugboat captains listening to the VHF radio.
There was a lack of understanding of either the English language or the pidgin English that the Chinese, and it really was difficult to understand what the Chinese captain was saying, and the Chinese captain was obviously having trouble understanding what the salvage master was saying. And so it was just unable to really be put in the right position to the salvage master.
You were listening to this channel?
We were all the time on the channel.
What
obviously.
did it sound like?
Very difficult to understand the Chinaman, and the Chinaman was obviously having difficulty understanding the pilot.
So necessity became the mother of invention, and an original solution was sought. A chef at the local Chinese takeaway in Milford Haven was hurriedly recruited and invited to act as interpreter. He left the special fried rice and hurried to the Coast Guard's office.
The pilot had to talk to the radio operator, and he explained it to me, and I then translated back to the Chinese crew.
But the view from the Chinese tug was somewhat different. Although the captain didn't speak English, others on board did, including 2 people placed there by the salvors themselves. The Chinese deny there was any requirement for an interpreter at all. Indeed, their concerns were much more serious. The captain's major problem, as he told us himself, was that no one on land seemed to have a coherent plan or strategy for the whole salvage operation. He told us the issue of communications was a red herring, as the tug's Dutch managers were to emphasize later.
I told you earlier that SMIT personnel, there was a pilot on board at all times. They had very, very clear communications at all times with the operations center. And suddenly we had a call over the radio by a person speaking Cantonese. This person apparently was engaged by the Coast Guard. So I wonder only, did the Coast Guard knew what SMIT was doing at the time of the salvage? Because they didn't have to ask us, they should have asked the SMIT captain on board of this tug what was going on. Not some Chinese waiter asking, what are you doing?
In a break between storms, various tugs tried to lasso the tanker, and then at 3:20, helped by a helicopter and the rising tide, the Chinese tug managed to get a line across the Sea Empress to begin towing. It was the long-awaited moment. The bucking tanker had at last been tamed. The big tug had the power now to control and hold the tanker. The orders apparently were to move the tanker out of her basin trap and back into the main channel.
What happened then? The Sea Empress started moving, helped by the current and by the pulling power of this big tug. She was bouncing on the seabed. She was moving indeed in northeasterly direction, but then when she was free, there was no backup. There was no backup tug, and the captain of this tug asked the salvage master of SMIT, what do we do next? And he said, I don't know. There was no backup tugs, and again, no plan.
Once the Sea Empress was held, why did the tug let the line go?
She had problems with the maneuvering. And she was worried that she should run aground herself. And that's why she had to let go at a certain moment.
That was a bit of a cock-up, wasn't it?
It was, of course, not nice.
Mr. Kofferman strongly denies there was no overall plan. Meanwhile, the Sea Empress had broken free in the storm. Other tugs had dropped their lines. It was the beginning of the end. As she headed for more rocks, the Chinese bowed out.
Looks like we're pulling out of here. Chopper's coming in 5 minutes. Not much else we can do, really, so I'm leaving.
The tanker floated off the rocks again as the tide rose and drifted across the estuary. Smaller tugs tried to hold her but failed, and she ran aground once more. By Monday, there were still strong winds, but the weather was easing. The 21-man salvage crew went back on board to prepare the vessel for the long overdue transfer of oil. In London, there was still guarded optimism.
Carriage by sea will always have some element of risk, and where an incident does occur, we're determined to react swiftly and so effectively reduce the pollution or damage caused.
But for observers who were a little closer to the scene, the slowly spreading oil slicks gave rise to real doubt that the now developing pollution problem was actually being handled in the most effective way. The tanker ran aground once more during the afternoon. She refloated on the flood tide, but the tugs simply couldn't hold her, and she broke adrift running aground yet again on a spike of rocks near the headland.
What made me so angry on Monday night when I learnt that she'd gone on the rocks was that all the way through that weekend I was being told that this was a strategy and it was the only one that was working, and they were optimistic it would be successful. The media were being told that at all the press conferences that were held. I know for a fact that that was what the Secretary of State for Wales was told, and presumably the Secretary of State for Transport when they both visited the scene on Friday. Now, it was apparent, it should have been apparent all the way over that weekend that the resources available were just not there to carry out the strategy. It was impossible. It was inevitable. It would fail.
There is a fresh discharge of oil from the vessel to the south and the west within 1 kilometre of St Anne's Head.
By day 6, the worst had happened and thousands of tons of crude oil began to hemorrhage from the stricken vessel. Over 3,000 tons has landed here on the beautiful tourist beaches of Tenby. But it's now clear that much of this pollution could possibly have been avoided if, as we now know, offers of powerful pollution control and dispersal vessels from Norway had been accepted. These are state-of-the-art oil gulpers. With special booms attached to their hulls, they sweep the polluted waters, first skimming and trapping, and finally sucking the oil out of the water into their holds. A pair was offered to the Marine Pollution Control Unit at Milford Haven by the Norwegians, but the offer was rejected.
We have the command and control, and we have the expertise in this country, and we didn't need theirs. It was a very nice offer, and we would make the same offer to them if they were in the same situation. Oil recovery, dealing with oil, is a messy business, and when it comes right down to it, on certain areas of coastline, it really is a shovel and a bucket job.
But does it have to be? This is the Crystal Sea, a state-of-the-art anti-pollution vessel custom-made to receive the oil and seawater emulsion from other pollution collectors, separate the mix, and return clean water to the sea.
We would act as a mothership, take the emulsion from these ships and process it on board our ship, and we would, the capacity on our ship is about 5 times the combined capacity of those ships.
That would have helped clear up the pollution. But there's another question mark. Could the pollution have been avoided in the first place by taking the oil off the stricken Sea Empress long before the sea snatched it from her ruptured tanks? According to the government minister, Lord Goshen, the answer was no.
What has been put to all of us is the fact that if the vessel remains in her current location for much longer, there is a very high chance indeed of her breaking up and of all the remaining cargo that remains on board to be lost.
Lord Goshen was asked about the strategy for dealing with the tanker and its oil.
Well, it's been important to move her the whole time. What we haven't had is the ability to take oil from her.
But there may have been options.
This ship, the MT Sarita, is the first specially equipped tanker for efficient lightering of disabled tankers.
This is the Norwegian vessel, the Sarita, a specially adapted tanker which can extract oil from another tanker even while it's aground and in gales up to force 9. But no one asked the Norwegians for their help.
We would have supplied other equipment from Norway, pipelines, then to have pumping equipment on board the ship and pump the oil over to this tanker, which could take 125,000 tons of cargo.
In the best case scenario, that dreadful spill of some 60,000 tons subsequently would have been avoided.
Well, at least it would have been a lot less.
Do the British authorities know of the existence of your vessel?
Yes, British authorities know of the existence.
Did you receive a call for any assistance?
No, we didn't receive a call from any assistance.
The news headlines this morning: another attempt to refloat the tanker Sea Empress has been abandoned. Labour has said
It was becoming a familiar story, but now time was fast beginning to run out for the salvors. The heavy spring tides that helped float the vessel on other occasions were beginning to recede, and as they did, the Sea Empress could have remained imprisoned for a month. And now the minister was under fire as it became clear there had been mistakes.
The operation hasn't gone according to plan. We've been faced with very severe weather conditions indeed, very strong tides. And you simply, I agree that it's frustrating, but you simply cannot just say, oh, she must be got off. We're all trying extremely hard to get her off.
By now the press was beginning to give the minister a rough ride.
But if you'll let me answer your question, we might get somewhere. What you must have is the ability to bring people in as quickly as possible, and the ability to bring in salvage experts. And I think it is recognised that we do have here the world's leading salvage experts here.
Nevertheless, the pollution damage was increasing by the hour. 70,000 tons had spilled. Conservationists were becoming worried as the oil moved towards the nature reserve islands of Skoma and Stockholm. That evening, the tanker was finally dragged off the rocks and out of the basin near St Anne's Head, and under her own power, sailed up the channel to a safe berth in the Milford Haven port. She was finally where she was supposed to have been 6 days earlier. The salvage plan had succeeded at last, but only after an accident had been allowed to turn into an environmental disaster. The first day of the post-mortem, as the authorities got ready to take the remaining 65,000 tons of oil off the Sea Empress, protective booms were being put across the mouths of rivers further down the coast. The questions were only just beginning about the way the operation was carried out, the strategy behind it, and whether there'd been confusion at the control centre. Who was actually in charge there?
I think the salver has a responsibility. Then the harbour master was looking after the thing in the communicative mode, and the MOD and the government agency for pollution also had a responsibility. So I don't think that there were quite a few agendas there, and I don't think the whole thing was particularly well managed from the point of view of control.
And do you believe one person should have been in overall command?
I do think so. As I said, this is my first, but I thought was entirely lacking was one individual controlling and monitoring the whole thing.
Was it necessary, in your opinion, for the Sea Empress to bounce around this basin for 5 days?
I don't think so. I honestly don't think so. It grieves me to think that a ship like this, with a cargo like this, should end up in this situation. It's absolutely disastrous for us. Of course, it's disastrous, more importantly, for the community here. It's disastrous for the fishermen. The whole thing is disgraceful.
As the clean-up operation continued, the government reacted to growing disquiet about the way the salvage operation had been handled. It announced a formal inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the accident and the subsequent salvage attempts. It was to examine the roles played by each of the several companies involved.
I know the House shares my disappointment and frustration at the repeated failures of the earlier salvage attempts and my deep concern at the environmental consequences. We must find out why that happened and whether there is any more that could be done to make a future salvage operation more likely to succeed. To that end, I have asked the Chief Inspector of Marine Accidents to extend the scope of the current investigation to include the salvage operations.
Are you saying that you're proud of your operation? You think it was conducted with great success?
I was very proud when the vessel came afloat. I congratulated my team. And I'm, to be honest, a bit frustrated and hurt by what is being said now.
There were failures with the early salvage attempts. Sir George Young has said that.
I do not agree with that. There were no failures.
What, do you think he's not telling the truth in the House? Or?
I think he has not been well informed.
The Salvage SMIT TAK say that that statement in the House was rather harsh and that you were misinformed, and they think they're being set up as scapegoats.
No, looking at what I said, I reiterate my unstinting admiration, which I'm sure the whole House shares, for the tireless way that the teams of salvers, together with members of the emergency services and others, have the effort they've put into the salvage operation. And I referred later on to their Herculean efforts.
But this is not an inquiry into bravery, it's an inquiry into what went wrong.
Indeed, but I don't think you should conclude from what I've said that I have set anybody up. On the contrary, I've asked an independent inquiry to do a thorough investigation of exactly what happened and then to publish it.
But something went badly wrong, didn't it?
Well, clearly a very serious incident has taken place. We need to find out whether any steps could have been taken to avoid it.
But that's exactly what the government said after the Brer disaster in 1993. There would be a formal investigation, and there was. Conclusions would be reached, and they were. Lessons would be learned, but they were not. One of the crucial recommendations to install tug cover over the western approaches to Milford Haven was fudged.
We had an arrangement whereby the western approaches would be covered on an informal arrangement by SMIT TAK, who said they'd keep a towing vessel in the southwest approaches this winter, subject to conditions of availability.
But in the event it didn't work, did it?
In the event, that tug was in Portugal and it was replaced by the Chinese tug.
But the Chinese tug was offered within hours of the disaster, yet this was turned down. So what was the value of having the Chinese tug there at all?
One of the reasons I set up an inquiry, not just into the cause of the accident, but also into the conduct of the salvage operation, is to answer a whole range of questions which your programme, and I'm sure others, would like to see answered.
The inquiry will establish the truth. Yes?
Not necessarily.
Why?
We cannot have an inquiry organised by the Department of Transport looking into the actions of the Department of Transport. My constituents and the people of Wales and people that are so vitally and rightly concerned about what has gone on here will not accept that. No matter how good an inquiry it is, they will say it is the department investigating itself. It will not be a credible inquiry.
The 14 million gallons of oil which poured out of the ruptured tanks of the Sea Empress is still finding its way onto the beaches of Western Britain. Thousands of birds have perished, marine conservation areas polluted, and untold damage done to life below the waves. There may yet be more to come. It took over 4 days before the giant spill occurred, so was enough done to anticipate the probability of the disaster, and was enough done to prepare for it in time? Those in charge say they couldn't have achieved more, yet the final arithmetic of the operation will produce a grim total. How much do you think you've recovered?
At sea, we have recovered some 9,000 tons of emulsion, which probably equates to about 3,000 tons of oil once it's processed in the terminal. And of course, we're continuing to recover that.
Forgive me, sir, about 90% of the oil is still out there as we talk.
There is no oil at sea detectable on the surface of the sea, apart from the immediate area.
That was not my question, with respect. 90% of the oil is still out there somewhere.
Of the oil spilled from the ship? Well, I won't argue with the percentage, but yes.
Where is it?
It is undergoing the natural process of dispersion.
It's under the water?
Yes, some will be under the water. The wave action will break up the emulsion and will put it down into small droplets into the water column.
But more oil might easily have been collected if the offer of the Crystal Sea had been accepted in the first place at the moment it was made. How much oil could you have picked up?
We have a capacity of about 5,000